Narrator deep, calm, commanding voice. Everything you were taught in history class was designed to hide one specific year. It hides a specific event. It hides a truth so massive, so terrifying in its implications, that once you see it, the world around you physically transforms. The buildings you walk past every day stop being just bricks and mortar. They become crime scenes. They become tombstones. We are told that history is a straight line, a slow, steady march of progress. First came the primitive mud huts, then the wooden shacks, then, miraculously, in the 1800s, we apparently figured out how to build neoclassical masterpieces with nothing but horse-drawn carts and hand chisels. We are told that the generation who built the Roman Colosseum forgot how to pave roads for 1,000 years during the Dark Ages, only to suddenly wake up in the 1700s and remember how to build structures that we, with our modern lasers and cranes, struggle to replicate today. But what if the progress wasn't a straight line? What if history is a wheel? Or more accurately, what if history is a palimpsest, an ancient manuscript where the original text has been scraped off so a new story can be written on top of it? But if you look closely, the old ink bleeds through, the old stone bleeds through. Today, we are peeling back the mudflood theory. We are investigating the global reset. This is the story of how the 1700s didn't just change the world, it buried the previous one. And by the end of this video, you won't just take my word for it. You'll walk outside and you'll see the evidence literally set in stone right under your feet. The Impossible Cityscape. Let's start with a simple observation. A child could make it. It requires no conspiracy books, no secret documents, just a pair of eyes. Look at any major city established before 1850. London, Paris, Rome, Moscow, Washington, D.C., or even older colonial cities in South America and Asia. Look at the ground floor. Now look at the street level. Do you notice the architectural schizophrenia? You will see a magnificent, 4-story neoclassical building. The upper floors are pristine. Ornate columns, massive windows, carvings of angels and mythological figures. Architectural perfection. Then your eyes travel down. You see the ground floor windows. They are often half sunk into the pavement. You see a grand arched doorway that should be 20 feet high, but someone has cut a normal-sized door into the bottom of it. The actual ground floor looks like a grimy basement that has been cleaned up and rented out to a Starbucks. Why is the first floor almost always halfway underground? Mainstream architecture calls this a raised basement, or an English basement. They say it was a stylistic choice to raise the piano nobile, the main living floor, above the smell of the horse manure on the streets. That sounds logical until you actually look at the windows. They aren't basement windows. They have the same ornate lintels, the same decorative keystones, the same expensive stonework as the upper floors. Who spends a fortune carving angelic wings into a window frame that they are deliberately burying in the dirt? Either the architects of the old world were pathologically insane, or the dirt wasn't there when the window was built. This leads us to the forbidden word, mudflood. The theory posits that sometime in the recent past, specifically between 1700 and 1850, a cataclysmic liquefaction event occurred. This wasn't a flood of just water like Noah's story. This was a flood of sediment, of mud, of liquefied earth. It buried the lower levels of the world's cities in a wave of silty slurry that subsequently hardened. When the survivors, or perhaps the interlopers, dug out the streets, they didn't dig down to the original foundations. They left the first few meters buried, creating the sunken cityscapes we see today. But why 1700 to 1850? Why that specific window? Let's look at the historical record, not for what it says, but for what it doesn't say. We are taught that the 1800s were the century of invention, the Industrial Revolution, but look closely at the photographs and paintings of the early 1800s. You see hulking, massive structures that seem ancient already, coated in grime, but the streets are mud. Not paved roads with mud on them, just liquid earth. You see paintings of cities with people walking on wooden planks several feet above the ground to cross the street, which is just a river of mud. Why was every city literally sinking into the earth? And more importantly, who dug them out? In Paris, Baron Haussmann is celebrated for renovating the city in the mid-1800s. History tells us he demolished slums to build wide boulevards. But the photographs of old Paris before Haussmann show a city that looks like it's drowning. Narrow streets with medieval houses leaning in, sure, but look at the ground. The street levels are chaotic. We are told Haussmann tore buildings down, but could his real job have been simply to dig out the mud, pave the new ground level, and disguise the bottom floors of surviving buildings? This isn't just a European phenomenon. Go to the ruins of ancient sites that were supposedly rediscovered in the 1800s. Pompeii, buried in volcanic ash, yes, but stayed buried until the exact same historical window, the mid-1700s, when the European elite suddenly started digging. Troy, Schliemann digs it up in the 1870s. The Sphinx, buried up to its neck in sand until the 1800s. It's as if a global event covered the world, and a global class of people all decided to start excavating at the same time. The anatomy of a reset. We are starting to see a pattern, a cataclysm, a flood of earth, a wave of energy, a fire destroys the infrastructure of a globe-spanning empire. The population is decimated. The cities are buried hollow and silent. Then comes the script. If you want to reset humanity, you don't just kill people. You kill their memory, you destroy their connection to the past. To do this, the reset team had a specific modus operandi, and we can see it in 4 phases: bury, dig, lie, and inherit. Phase 1, the burying. The lower levels are filled with mud. This isn't just dirt. In many excavations, these lower levels are described as archaeological fill. Tons of it. Uniform layers. This serves a dual purpose. 1, it hides the reality of the original street level. 2, it covers up the technology. If the windows are melting the snow around them because of radiant heating systems, bury the windows. If the basements contained energy devices, water pumps that required no moving parts, or geothermal systems, bury the basements. Don't knock the buildings down, that's too much work. Just bury the bottom 2 stories. It turns a 4-story palace into a 2-story house instantly. You lower the ceiling of human aspiration. Phase 2, the digging out. You wait. You let a generation die off. Then the industrialists arrive. They are the diggers. They clear the main thoroughfares, but they don't dig down to the original doors. They clear the mud from the middle of the street and pack it down, or they use the mud to pave the road with bricks a few meters higher than the original cobblestones. Now everyone has to walk down into their old buildings. The doorways become stairwells. The grand marble vestibules become subcellars. This creates the phenomenon of the orphan staircases. Have you seen them in old cities? A grand staircase in a park leading down to a river. It just goes straight into the water. We are told it's because the rivers were dammed and the water level rose. But look at the surrounding park. The river hasn't risen. The ground around the staircase has been artificially raised, or the riverbank was not properly maintained. Actually, the staircase used to lead to the surface of a road that is now 20 feet under the silt. They dug out the staircase because it was pretty, but they didn't dig out the road. Phase 3, the lying. Once the city is accessible, again, you need a history to explain who built it. You write the narrative of the ancient Romans and the Renaissance. This is why so many buildings from the 1700s and 1800s look exactly like Roman temples. It's not that they were copying them, it's that they belong to the exact same architectural language because they were built by the exact same continuous civilization just 50 years prior. Or perhaps they are the same buildings repaired. You create the world's fairs. Listen closely to the story of every world's fair between 1851 and 1915. The Crystal Palace in London, the White City in Chicago, the Panama Pacific Exhibition in San Francisco. The narrative is that these massive, sprawling, neoclassical mini-cities were built in 2 years, used for 1 summer, and then just demolished. Look at the photographs of the construction. It's a lie. There are photos of the Chicago World's Fair construction from 1891. In the background, the buildings are already there, fully formed, while workers hammer at a few planks in the foreground. We are told they built the White City over 200 buildings in just 26 months using horse and carriage. Today, we can't fix a pothole in 26 months. The White City wasn't built, it was excavated. They dug out the ancient Tartarian white stone city that was already there, repainted it, and claimed they built it to show off their modern prowess. Then they demolished it. You don't demolish a marble city that took you 2 years to build. You demolish it because you are erasing the evidence of the old owners. Or, as the theory suggests, large parts of it burned down in a mysterious fire, a controlled demolition to destroy the history they couldn't claim. Phase 4, the inheriting, the blank slate is created. The orphaned buildings are now owned by the reset, banks, and the nobility of the new empires. The Romanovs, the Habsburgs, the British Crown, they simply occupy the empty castles. They don't build Buckingham Palace, they move into an existing structure and repurpose it. They don't build the Hermitage. They clear the mud from the basement, hang some paintings, and call it their own. This explains the utter absurdity of the eugenics records of the aristocracy. They claim descent from divine kings, Roman emperors, or biblical prophets. Why? Because there was a giant gap in the record. They couldn't connect their bloodline to the previous builders with any logical, rational history, so they created a mythological bridge. They didn't build the palaces. They were just the first to pull the skeletons out of them and lock the doors. The buried technology from the sound to the spires. So, what was the world like before the mudflood? If it was just a bunch of guys with chisels, nobody would need to reset it. The reset implies a threat. The buried lower levels imply a function. Let's look at the spires. The old world was filled with them. Now we are told these are just aesthetic choices. A steeple is for a bell. A dome is for a painted ceiling. A pointy finial on a roof is just decoration. But what if it wasn't? Consider the architecture not as art, but as a circuit board. The structure is the hardware. The mudflood theorists, particularly those who focus on Tartarian technology, propose that these buildings were tuned to a specific frequency. The metal spires were antennas, the domes were resonators, the multiple underground levels were conduits for water, yes, but moving water through spiral geometries creates an electric charge. It's called the electrokinetic effect. If you run water through nanochannels or over quartz crystals under pressure, you generate a massive electrostatic field. Old world architecture is riddled with quartz. Granite, used obsessively in base levels, is composed of quartz crystal. Limestone, used in upper levels, is piezoelectric when stressed. The building itself was a battery. The mudflood didn't just bury the first floor, it short-circuited the grid. The drill holes we see in massive granite blocks around the world, like at the unfinished obelisk or Machu Picchu, aren't from splitting the stone with wedges. They are plug sockets for an energy distribution system, or perhaps massive connection points for a metallic grid. Think about the large-scale casting of iron in the 1800s. We see facades made entirely of cast iron, the pillars, the radiators. Every old building has them. Mainstream history says that before the 1880s, electricity wasn't a household utility. So why do these pre-1800 buildings have a specific room in the basement, a coal vault? And why do they have hollow floors, the dumbwaiters, and pneumatic tubes? Hotels from the 1850s in New York have photographs showing pipes and tubes operating panels. We are told it was for pneumatic messages, a puff of air blowing a canister, but look at the complexity of the metalwork. It's a wiring harness for something we wouldn't recognize. Perhaps the most compelling evidence of a buried tech is the sheer impossibility of the artifacts. The Vajra from Eastern traditions representing a thunderbolt, it looks like a Tesla coil, the ceremonial mace of the House of Commons, the lollipop held by Egyptian gods, the handbags of the Sumerians. These recurring symbols might not be symbolic. They might be representative of a portable technological device that interacts with the environment. The Mudflood event was the great disconnect. Something caused the soil to liquefy, the ground to rise, and the basements to flood. But it wasn't just a natural disaster, it was a targeted disruption of a resonant civilization. The new rulers established a combustion empire. Coal, steam, oil. They broke the free energy grid of the old world, buried the evidence, and then sold us back the power in the form of a monthly bill. That's the true reset. Part 6. Echoes in the Age of Discovery. Let's attack the timeline from another angle. The Age of Discovery, 1492. Columbus sails the ocean blue, but who drew the maps he used? The Peary Rise map. The Urbano Monti map of 1587. When you look at them, the continent of Antarctica is not a white, blurry mass. It has detailed coastlines and ice-free land. Mainstream history says this is impossible because Antarctica has been covered in ice for millions of years. But the maps are right there. They are compiled from older ancient charts. This suggests that the cartographic knowledge of the globe was complete long before the Age of Discovery began. The navigators of the 1500s weren't discovering empty land. They were exploring the ruins of a shattered global grid. Marco Polo didn't walk to China on a blank land. He traveled on the highways of the Silk Road, which were the degraded remains of an older Tartarian highway system. The Roman roads that crisscross Europe and deep into Russia, often built before the Roman legions supposedly got there, are perhaps Tartarian roads the Romans simply repaired. When Lewis and Clark set out to map the American West in 1804, they were carrying maps. They knew exactly where they were going. They described finding mounds and earthen fortifications. The Mandan Indians who Lewis and Clark stayed with were described as having blue eyes and blonde hair, living in advanced circular earthen lodges that looked suspiciously like small-scale versions of European forts. The Welsh Indians' legend persists. It's not that the Welsh sailed there, it's that a unified aesthetic of construction existed across the world, and the survivors of the American Reset were pockets of the same global culture. The Mudflood is the missing puzzle piece that explains why a tiny expedition of 33 men could discover a continent that already had millions of people and complex trade networks. They weren't discovering it, they were mapping the damage, reporting back to the crowns of Europe on what the mud had uncovered and what it had buried. The reset wasn't the end of the world, it was a hostile takeover. Part 7. The skin of the earth. If a mudflood happened, it must have left a geological signature. And it did. The most obvious one is sterile soil. Archaeologists use this term all the time. They dig through history, and between two layers of cultural development, there is often a layer of sterile, clay or silt that contains no artifacts. It's a blank page. In hundreds of excavation reports, this sterile layer is found directly on top of the original ground surface of the 1004. 1700 settlements. Take the North American coast. Early settlers in the 1600s and 1700s described the soil as being black and rich, but underneath that topsoil, a compact layer of yellow clay. That clay is not generated through normal topsoil sedimentation. That clay is a deposit. When you look at the Sahara Desert, we are taught it was always a desert, but the sand is sitting on top of skeletons of whales and seashells. It was an ocean floor that was raised. Could the mud have just been the aftermath of a massive crustal shift? A pole shift or a crustal displacement? Charles Hapgood, a respected academic, corresponded with Albert Einstein about the theory that the Earth's crust slides over the mantle in a single catastrophic leap. Einstein wrote the foreword to Hapgood's book. What happens when the crust slides? The oceans don't just stay neatly in their basins. They slosh over the continents. This sloshing isn't just blue water. It's billions of tons of churned-up sediment from the continental shelf sprayed over the land. A muddy tsunami of planetary proportions. No one is safe. The survivors of this event would find their cities covered in a smooth, drying concrete of silt. They would dig out the main routes, but just like with snowplows in a blizzard, they wouldn't clear the snow down to the grass. They'd just plow the middle. And as the mud dried, it became the new ground. That's the reset. Part 8. The impossible stone. Let's return to the architecture. I want you to open a search engine right now or after the video and look up embossed brick or ornate cast iron facade, San Francisco. You will see buildings where the stone or metal looks like poured glass. The crispness of the edges is impossible to achieve with a hand chisel on granite, which has a hardness of 7 on the Mohs scale. Working granite with hand tools requires years of training and a sharpness of chisel that dulls in minutes. Yet these 1,700 architects covered entire square miles in granite filigree. How the mudflood theory intersects here with what's called the soft stone theory. Did the previous civilization possess a geopolymer technology? Roman concrete was self-healing. What if the old world didn't carve stone but cast it? They used a slurry of minerals and a binding agent that we don't have, poured it into molds, and it grew crystals in the shape of the mold. This is the only logical explanation for the columns at the Cathedral of St. Isaac in St. Petersburg. A single piece of malachite, giant granite monoliths shipped from Finland, cut perfectly smooth with zero error margins using 1,800's technology. It's a fairy tale. The mudflood wasn't just a burial, it was the hardening agent. The slurry that buried the cities was chemically related to the slurry they built the cities with. Perhaps the byproduct of their energy production was a specific silicate waste material. When the grid failed, the waste processing failed, and the liquid stone just covered the land. Look at the cobblestone streets in your city. Look at the Belgian blocks. Those aren't random cobbles, they are the hardened spill-off from the manufacturing process, broken up and reused to pave the new, elevated streets. The evidence is literally under the tires of your car. Part 9. The spirit of the old world. If a civilization that built such beauty was erased, what was its philosophy? It clearly wasn't the grim, soot-covered Dickensian hellscape of the 1850 smokestack era. Look at the old spa towns. The bath houses of Baden, the Roman baths of England, the giant pools of the Hearst Castle, or the Sutro baths in San Francisco. These weren't just rich people taking a swim. Water was central, beautiful structured pools with acoustic domes. Healing frequencies. The water wasn't just for cleaning, it was for regeneration. The reset culture replaced the sacred bath with the dingy pub. Replaced the harmonic dome with the steamy factory. It systematically grubbed out the soul of the city. The Tartarian aesthetic was open, free, integrated with nature. The reset aesthetic is boxes, controlled boxes. The orphan imagery is everywhere. The statues in the graveyards of the early 1800s are weeping angels, women holding empty cribs, a societal grief that is palpable. You don't get a continent covered in weeping ladies carved in marble mourning at tombs, unless a continent-wide mourning event actually occurred. The Victorian obsession with death, seances, and speaking to the dead wasn't a weird fashion trend. It was post-traumatic stress disorder on a civilizational scale. They were surrounded by the ghosts of the previous inhabitants. They were living in the dead's houses, using their silverware and opening their closets. The whole aesthetic of the 1800s, the heavy drapes, the dark wood, was a psychological attempt to cover up the blinding white light of the old world. They painted over the brilliant murals, they wallpapered over the marble, they silenced the walls. Part 10. The revelation, the rabbit hole opens now. Why is this information so suppressed? If there was a mud flood and there was a reset, and the old world had free energy and a unified language, why don't the history books say, "Oops, we had a catastrophe, let's rebuild"? Why do they hide the specific year? Because if the reset was an accident, the inheritors are just innocent beneficiaries. But if the reset was a weapon, then the inheritors are murderers, and the evidence points to it being a weapon. Tartaria didn't just fall. It was digested. The 1700s were a series of massive global wars, the Great Northern War against Sweden, which controlled vast Tartarian adjacent territories, the conquest of Siberia, the Opium Wars in China, systematic burning of the indigenous records in North and South America. In Europe, the Napoleonic Wars serve as a cover story for a massive demolition derby across the continent, focusing on the destruction of specific domes and spires. Moscow was burned to the ground in 1812. The official story is the Russians burned it to spite Napoleon. But the Moscow that burned looked nothing like a wooden village. Photographs of pre-fire Moscow show a city rivaling Paris in its neoclassical splendor. The fire was likely a directed energy attack, recorded in the history books as a simple sabotage designed to liquidate the technological evidence. The specific year hidden in history class is roughly 1776 to 1815. That is the gestation period of the New World Order. The American Revolution, 1776, and the French Revolution, 1789, were not populist uprisings. They were coups against the remnants of the Tartarian/divine right of kings network. Look at the symbology. The Illuminati, pyramid with the eye on the Great Seal of the United States, finalized in 1782 under mysterious circumstances. The Novus Ordo Seclorum, New Order of the Ages, that's not poetry, that's a press release. They were announcing the reset. Look at the architecture of Washington, D.C., designed by a Masonic architect, a city of buried tombs, Egyptian obelisks, and a Capitol building that looks like St. Peter's Basilica. They were building a command center for the new empire on top of the bones of the old one. Part 11. The call to action. Check your city. Music shifts. The investigative pulse slows down. It becomes intimate, direct. The narrator's voice lowers, speaking directly to the viewer. I've told you a story, but it's not my story. It's written in the geology of your hometown. You are now a detective, so here is your mission. I'm asking you right now to pause this video after this section, or when you're done watching, and walk outside. Go to the oldest part of your city and check the old buildings. Walk to the public library, the Masonic Lodge, the courthouse, the old bank building. Look at the base of it. Do not look at the people. People are not your focus. Look at the ground line. Ask yourself these 4 questions. 1. Where is the actual ground? Compare the sidewalk to the level of the land in a nearby empty lot or park. Is the building sunk or is the city raised? 2. Look at the windows at sidewalk level. If they are fully exposed, is the sill touching the pavement? If they are basement windows, are they beautifully carved? If the stonework is ornate, it wasn't buried originally. Touch the ground. Does the concrete of the sidewalk lap up against a windowsill like a tide frozen in time? 3. Find a doorway, an old wooden front door. Look at the steps. Do they go up to the door or down? If you enter a building and have to step down, you are entering through a window that was broken out to become a door after the street was raised, or you're stepping down into the buried original floor. 4. Look at the arches. Some buildings have a massive archway bricked up, and a smaller door cut into the middle of the cobblestone filler. That massive archway was the original entrance. Why brick it in? Because the street level outside was raised so high. A horse and carriage couldn't fit through the arch anymore without digging a trench in the lobby. If you see these things, the sunken windows, the mud line, the bricked-up arches, take a photo, post it in the comments. Tag the city. Let's create a map, a global inventory of the buried grids, because this is not just history. It's the crime scene of the millennium. And the algorithm loves engagement. The more you comment with what you find outside your own front door, the more the YouTube algorithm sends this message to others who are still asleep. Your comment is a signal boost. You aren't just commenting, you are excavating. Conclusion: the year we start over, everything you were taught in history class was designed to hide that one specific year when humanity fell. Hidden in plain sight, encoded in the very buildings where we drink our coffee and go to work. The 1700s were not a time of primitive exploration. They were the aftermath of an apocalypse. The ones who wrote the textbooks are not the ones who built the columns. The ones who paid for the factories were not the sculptors of the statues. We are living in a post-apocalyptic world, and we have been calling the apocalypse modernity. So go outside. Check the old buildings in your own city. Take that photo. Send that comment. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The ground beneath you is not the original surface. It is the roof of a buried kingdom. Thank you for joining me on this 30-minute excavation of memory. We didn't dig up any bones today, but we dug up the blueprints of a lie. Keep your eyes on the stone. Keep your frequency high, and I will see you in the next investigation.